All right, so greetings to everyone, those that have tuned in on the digital platforms, for those that are listening in on radio. This is the Cyber Hitchhiker, and we are back in studio for another podcast. And we are starting a new series just based on the sermons that I've been listening to at our local church here in Rondebosch in Cape Town, and also just speaking to people. I think it's good that we delve a little bit deeper into the church, if you know what I mean. So we are going to entitle this series, Let's Talk Church. And church is definitely in inverted commas because for some people, church means one thing. For other people, it means something completely different. But this is a podcast, and we are here to talk about things that sometimes are a little bit uncomfortable. Hopefully not too controversial, because the last thing we want to do is be taken off air. But let's get into it and let's talk church. So I thought let's start off with, and here's the thing, guys, I don't know everything, so I do a lot of research and put a lot of stuff down on paper in front of me on a screen so that I can have this information ready for you guys. And we might look up a couple of things online on the fly while we're busy talking, just to go in a little bit deeper if we need to. But I've got a few things written down here that I've just been going over myself, and I thought let's start way back in the early church. Let's have a look and see where the church began. Now, I know most of you guys say, yeah, but Vaughan, we can read the Bible and we can read the book of Acts and we can see, yeah, but there's a lot of other sources and a lot of other things that happened from the time Jesus died, after his resurrection, after the apostles died, going through the early church history through about 10 generations to about 300 AD. And I just want to have a look at the early Christian church here. So, have you ever noticed that the Bible actually gives us no clue what Jesus looks like? All of the paintings that we have are just artists' ideas of how he might have looked. Funnily enough, when I was looking this up, I found out a very interesting fact. And the first representation of Christ on record is actually a derisive graffiti. It's a mockery of Christ that was graffitied on the wall of a house on Palatine Hill in Rome. And it pictured the body of a man being crucified, but with the head of a donkey. And the inscription read, Aleximenos worships his God. Now, I have no clue what that means, so let's just quickly, while we've got time, have a look and see what this is, what is going on here. So the approximate translation is that it was a mockery of God, and this mockery was basically, I just want to see what it actually says here. Let's just go to Wikipedia and have a look. So it's a piece of Roman graffiti, and let's just see, I want to figure out what that actually means. Shows a young man worshipping a crucified donkey. The Greek inscription, approximately translated, indicates that the graffiti was apparently meant to mock a Christian named Aleximenos. So Aleximenos was actually a name of a Christian at that time, and he was being mocked for his faith by them putting up this graffiti painting of a man being crucified with the head of a donkey. So let's have a look with that in mind, the early Christian church. And from the time of Nero, which was around 64 AD, until the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the Edict of Milan, which happened in 313 AD. And this is, the Edict of Milan is where Christianity was made legal. Up until that point, Christianity was not a legal religion, or a legal movement, or a legal practice for people to openly practice their faith after Jesus died. It was not recognized as one of the official religions. So Christianity, or the faith, was officially regarded as a religio prava, which means an evil or depraved religion. How crazy is that? Now, obviously, this wasn't from the people. This was from the governing people that were basically governing at the time, which was the invading force of Rome. And this was back in the day, guys, when a church wasn't a building. Yes, these early believers did not have church buildings to meet in. They met most commonly in homes, as we can read in Acts. And the first church buildings actually didn't start to appear until around the 200s ADs. We cannot have a podcast without a cup of coffee, and thank you to Our Daily Bread for giving us these amazing, huge coffee mugs. So the early church buildings only started appearing at around the 200 ADs. And how crazy is this? The early church, obviously, I mean, today we are so used to having so many different denominations and even variations of different church faiths in the way they practice, from the Reformed faith to the Charismatics to the Evangelicals to the Pentecostals to the Presbyterians and everyone in between. You can even include Anglicans, Catholics, if I'm allowed to say that. But here's the thing. In the early church, they did not have denominations as we think of them today. But it doesn't mean that they didn't have serious disagreements within the ranks. They did, obviously, and they did not find this surprising. They felt they were dealing with matters of ultimate truth. It was important to them. And obviously with error. So matters to be taken with the most uttermost seriousness didn't mean churches split up. It meant that they had serious debates and sometimes disagreements on these things. Now, we can talk about the early Christians and how they were targeted for persecution, obviously because of the fact that Christianity was a fringe, or what they called the Way back then, was a fringe religion. But early Christians were targets of repeated persecutions and some of the most unspeakable cruelty. And I named this section "Torn by Dogs, Nailed to Crosses." And I'll give you some examples. The Emperor Nero blamed Christians. Now, these things happen in modern days as well. That's why I'm doing this. Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire that destroyed 10 of the 14 city wards in Rome in 64 AD. This started a massive war, by the way, but we'll get to that later. And this is a fire which he blamed the Christians for in order to persecute them. But it's apparent now that he ordered this fire to be set himself. So he burned 10 of his own 14 city wards down to the ground just so that he could blame the Christians. The historian Tacitus, not a Christian, said that Nero had the believers torn up by dogs, nailed to crosses, and even used as human torches to illuminate his garden at night. So when he walked around his garden at night, he had burning bodies making light in his garden. But Christians were not under persecution everywhere all the time. The persecutions were definitely sporadic, and there were peaceful intervals in between. And they varied in their intensity, and they were mostly localized. Now, we talk about the end times a lot, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing about end times because for most of us, we know that study these things, end times started a long time ago. It's not just something that started now. It actually started around the times I'm talking about, if not further back during the times of the disciples when John was writing Revelations on the Isle of Patmos. But there was a decree that was made, and you had to get a certificate. Now, listen to this. There were 2 all-out empire-wide persecutions intended to utterly destroy the church at this time. The first was under the Emperor Decius, and it began in December of 249 AD. And everyone in the empire had to get a certificate. Does this sound familiar to modern-day times, guys? But this is 249 AD. They had to get a certificate from a government officer verifying that he or she had offered a sacrifice to the gods. So you had to get a certificate after sacrificing to gods with a small g. And they did this because we know that as a Christian, you could not do this. The act was something that you could not do in good conscience because your faith did not allow you to do it. The second was called the Great Persecution, which happened after this, and it began in around February 303 AD. And this was under Emperor Diocletian. And Galerius, the empire's second in command under Diocletian, was behind this persecution policy, and it continued even after Diocletian's death. For 8 long years, official decrees ordered that Christians were not allowed to run for public office, their scriptures were confiscated, church buildings were destroyed, leaders were arrested, and pagan sacrifices were required by everyone, including Christians. All the reliable methods of torture were mercilessly employed, while wild beasts were used in arenas to tear Christians apart. People were burned. You were stabbed and slashed at and killed very slowly with blades. Obviously, you were crucified. You were often put on the rack, which is a machine that either pulls you lengthways or sideways until you split in half. But none of this stopped anything. It was to no avail. The penetration of the faith across the empire was so pervasive that the church could not be intermediated, nor could it be destroyed, even with all of this persecution. And then around 311 AD, the same Galerius, shortly before his death, weak and full of disease, he issued an edict of toleration. This happens today as well. And this included the statement that it was the duty of the Christians. He gave them this in an edict and stated, it is the duty of Christians to pray to their God for our good estate. That's how much the church was still an influence even under persecution. Now, I want to discuss baptism a little bit, because baptism is something that divides a lot of churches on how it's done and what you're supposed to do in order to be baptized. But I'm just going to go through what they did in the early church. Now, you must understand the reason why they had these methods back then was because, and we'll hear about this a little bit later, that there were spies that were sent into congregations to figure out what churches were doing, because it was an underground movement. And you had to be sure that people were actually saved and were actually Christians in your church before you baptized them, because some of them were spies. So the Christian writer Hippolytus, writing at around 200 AD, describes baptism in Rome. Candidates took off their clothing, were baptized 3 times after renouncing Satan and affirming the basic teachings of the faith. And then they would put on newer clothes. Then they joined the rest of the church in what we call communion. Back then it was known as the Lord's Supper, and in some churches we still call it that. Baptism was not entered into lightly. First, one went through an extensive period of preparation, which is called as a catechumen, excuse my pronunciation, and this lasted for as long in some churches as 3 years. Like I said, they had to make sure that you weren't a spy, involving close scrutiny of the catechumen's behavior. The church would only admit those who proved to be sincere in seeking a totally new life within that Christian community. Now, in those days, nowadays we see more like a social club, but in those days Christians drew members into their fellowship from every rank of society, every race, an affront to be proper, class-conscious Romans, anyone. A former slave who had worked the mines, who became a Christian, actually became the Bishop of Rome. And this guy's name was Callistus, and he became the bishop in 217 AD. And guess what, guys? Even back then, I mean, we speak about prosperity gospel. And I entitled this section, Send Me Your Letters and Your Gifts, because misusing the gospel for financial gain is by no means an invention of the 20th and 21st century religious, the modern day televangelists that ask you to send them money all the time. One of the earliest Christian documents after the New Testament, which is called the Didache, or the Didache, is a kind of manual on church practice on how to run and govern churches, because the church was growing rapidly. And this Didache actually warned in its principles about traveling preachers who came and asked for money. And there was a satirist, or what we would call nowadays a comedian, named Lucian in the 2nd century, and he ridiculed Christians for being so easily taken in by charlatans and often giving them money. Lucian recorded the notorious case of the philosopher Peregrinius, who attracted a devoted following amongst Christians, and he also attracted a lot of money. Before he was found out, the showman instincts of Peregrinius reached their climax when he actually died by publicly cremating himself at the close of the Olympic Games in 165 AD. Yeah, the Olympic Games are that old. And to touch on another topic that I've been discussing with people about, and I'm going through these quickly because I don't want to take up too much time, but Christianity is not a white man's religion. Like a lot of people throw that, especially in Africa, throw it in your face, and especially in South Africa. It's not a white man's religion. Back in the day, in the early church, 3/4 of the church were non-white. That's right, more than 3/4. The researcher David Barrett reports that by the year 300, or around 9 generations after the death of Christ, the world was around 10.4% Christian already, with 66% of those believers being non-white. The scriptures had been translated already into 10 languages, more than 410,000, representing 1 in every 200 believers at that time, had been martyred or had given their lives for their faith. 1 in every 200 Christians had died for what he believes in. And this all comes from, the information comes from a look at the early church by Ken Curtis, which was published in 2010. Now, how was, you might ask, Vaughan, how was the early church perceived? How was it looked at? So they were spirit-led from the time of Pentecost onwards. Those early Christians faced the most hostile world, walking in the power of the Holy Spirit, because that's exactly what it says in the book of Acts, that God would send us the Holy Spirit and he would give us power to go forth. If we were to read the newspapers of that day through a secular historical writer alive in the 1st century, here is what we would find. So these are secular written pieces from those times, however they were published in those days, written on a stone tablet, on a papyrus paper, put up on the city wall. But here's some of what was written. And when Pliny was governor of Bithynia, he wrote a most interesting letter to the Roman emperor at that time named Trajan, asking why Christians were being exterminated. And he added this: "I've been trying to get all the information I could regarding them. I have even hired spies to profess to be Christians and become baptized in order that they might get into the Christian services without suspicion. Contrary to what I had supposed, I found that Christians met at the dead of night or in the early morn, that they sang a hymn to Christ as their God, that they read from their own sacred writings, which is now the Bible, and partake of a very simple meal consisting of bread and wine and water. The water was added to the wine to dilute it in order that there might be enough for everyone, so that everyone could have communion. This is all that I could find out, except that they exhort each other to be subject to the government, not go against the government, to be subject to the government and to pray for all men." True Christians, guys, come on now. Writing in around 125 AD, Aristides, a Christian philosopher, looked at the believers of his day, and he said this: "They walk in all humility and kindness, and falsehood is not found among them, and they love one another. They despise not the widow, and they grieve not the orphan. He that hath a lot distributeth liberally to him that hath not. If they see a stranger, they bring him under their roof, and rejoice over him, as if it was their own brother. For they call themselves brethren, not after the flesh, but after the Spirit and in God. But when one of their poor passes away from the world, and if any of them see him, then he provides for his burial according to his own ability. And if they hear that any of their number is imprisoned or oppressed by the name of their Messiah, all of them will provide for his needs. And if it's possible, they may be delivered. They deliver him. And if there is a man among them that is poor and needy, and they have not among them any abundance of necessaries, they fast for 2 or 3 days, so that they may build up food supplies for the needy, and give them the necessary food." What on earth? I mean, how is that even possible? Have you ever heard of Christians acting that way nowadays and churches doing these kinds of things? Not eating for 3 days if you don't have, because you found someone on the street, and then giving him food after you've been able to keep extra food for you not eating. Doesn't happen, guys. Doesn't happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this off for the first segment of this episode, and we will come back in the next installment of Let's Talk Church, and we will discuss, where did church buildings come from? And we will take this further, because it is very, very interesting to figure out where the whole culture of having a church building comes from, why we have church buildings compared to what we have in modern days and what they did in those days, and where they first started meeting before there were buildings. But for now, that is the first part of Let's Talk Church out of the way, and we will catch you guys back on the airwaves in the next couple of weeks on various digital platforms. You can catch me on the Crossfire podcast on Spotify. You can check out my YouTube channel, The Cyber Hitchhiker. And you can also check out my Facebook page, Cyber Hitchhiker, for any content that is uploaded there, which will point you either to YouTube or to Spotify for the Crossfire podcast. But this is Vaughan, aka the Cyber Hitchhiker, for the first part of Let's Talk Church, saying goodbye and God bless.